My name is Shakil Choudhury, and I'm the author of Deep Diversity, Overcoming Us versus Them, and I'm the co-founder of Anima Leadership. Unconscious bias is a hidden or unintentional preference. It's a form of prejudice that's rooted at the unconscious mind level. Our unconscious mind categorizes people into groups. So issues like race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, all of these things are things that educational leaders need to be aware of. Unconscious bias is intimately linked to systemic forms of discrimination, which is different than overt forms of discrimination. And systemic forms of discrimination in the context of education or in society at large only become visible when we do something inherently abstract, which is collect data. And it's when we look at the experience of thousands and thousands of people that the gaps appear. Then we can start asking the questions of, why is it that women are systematically earning less than men? Why is it that racial minorities and indigenous peoples are undertreated in the healthcare system as compared to their white counterparts? And why is it that in education, that suspension and expulsion rates have something disproportionately to do with the identity of the students rather than their behavior? So systemic forms of discrimination are really the conversation we're trying to have. And this is central to inclusive leadership. But it's really difficult to talk about systemic forms of discrimination because most people, as soon as we say discrimination, are actually thinking about overt forms of discrimination, overt forms of racism or sexism or hate crimes. And those things happen, they're awful, they shouldn't happen, but educational leaders recognize that. What's harder to understand is, in fact, systemic. Now, as soon as we say racism, which is a systemic form of discrimination, most people in any organization, let alone education, would be hard-pressed to find the overt bigot. The overt bigot, the overt racist, the overt homophobe is very difficult to spot because those are few and far between in our organizations today. Systemic forms of discrimination play out in very subtle ways, and this is where the concept of unconscious bias comes in. What the research shows is that unconscious bias plays out in a super simple way. We basically are attracted to, want to support, advance, and engage people who are most like themselves, most like the decision makers. And so there's this in-group dynamic that's constantly at play. So for example, when I used to teach in education, at the end of the year with my colleagues, sitting down for coffee or our end of school lunch, we'd sometimes just talk about our students and talk about the year. Inevitably, there'd be favorites amongst our students. Well, why were some students favorites for us? Well, that's the unconscious bias. Some of it is conscious, but a lot of it is unconscious. There's something about the student that appeals to us. Usually it has something to do with us and our own stories, and usually our own identities. And so as a result, that creates that subtle liking or disliking, the attraction or repulsion, temperaments that are easier for us, temperaments that are harder for us. All of these things in some ways affect fairness in the system because basically if we're going the extra mile for some people and not for others, that's where disparities come in. And it's not just who we're willing to go the extra mile for, it's also the opposite. Who are we a little bit more critical of, more curt towards, colder, more dismissive of? All of these are ways in which we may be reacting to people who we perceive to be different than us, whether it's our students and whether it's our staff. And unconscious biases accumulate over time and are a significant contributor to the systemic forms of discrimination like racism, sexism, heterosexism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism, for example. there's a few things we need to understand in order to really get a handle on the concept of unconscious bias and how it relates to systemic forms of discrimination. With regards to inclusive leadership, unconscious biases cannot be understood outside of systemic forms of discrimination. Now, there are both nature forces at play and nurture forces, and we need to understand both how nature and nurture contribute. We have certain tendencies, and bias and stereotypes are part of that. You see, bias and stereotypes are completely normal parts of brain function. They're part of how we perceive, categorize, remember, and learn. We have to see the world with filters on, and we have to see the world in categories or boxes. If we didn't see the world with filters on and in boxes or categories, we'd be utterly overwhelmed by the millions of pieces of information our brain has to process every second. So even as you sit here now, watching this video, your brain's processing millions of pieces of information. Everything that's happening inside your body, heart rate, blood pressure, all the autonomic functions, through to what's happening outside your body. The colors in the room, the shades, the sounds, the feeling of your clothes on your body, air temperature. If you didn't have some way to filter out the noise and put things into some kind of categories, you wouldn't be able to pay attention to the person who's speaking. And that's part of the challenge for those of our community who are further down along the autism spectrum. It's information overload. Where do I put my attention? Whereas those of us who are described as neurotypical, we don't have to think about it. Our brain just does it. Well, filters, by their very nature, screen out some information and allow other information to come in. Filter is just another word for bias. And categories is just another word for stereotype. So what leaders have to understand is that bias and stereotypes are not the domain of bad people. They're the domain of all people. That's what it means to be human. It's the fact that we use these same neurological schemas and processes and shortcuts with other humans, and that's what contributes to the systemic forms of discrimination. Now, that may have served our cave-dwelling ancestors who lived in very small, violent tribes, but it does not serve us so well today when we're trying to live in a village of almost 7 billion people. So that's the nature end of things. Now, who and what we categorize and filter in or out, that's the process of socialization, and that's where the nurture end of things come in. So let me illustrate with a really concrete example. Pink and blue. In the Western world, we're taught about pink and blue from a very young age. My daughter, at age 2.5, was already convinced pink was the color for girls and blue was the color for boys. Well, where did she get that from? She didn't get that in our house because we didn't teach her that, and we didn't give her things that were pink. However, her brain, like all our brains, is designed to pick up social cues from those around us. So she picked up social cues from those around her, peer group, school, daycare, department stores where there's pink aisles and blue aisles. So she was already convinced, regardless of what we said, that pink was the color for girls and blue was the color for boys. Now, that might seem innocuous. It's just colors. But in fact, pink and blue are gender codes. Soon, it starts becoming who gets to play what sport, who gets to study what subject, and who gets demotivated from subjects like science, technology, math, and engineering. And then soon it starts becoming who gets to have what kind of job. When I say nurse, when I say engineer, when I say CEO of a bank, and I invite you to think about what's the first images that pop to mind for you. If we were to survey any random group of people, we'd see that there'd be a gender skew on our results. Where do we get it from? We get it from history. So fundamentally, we get taught who is in the center and who is not. And those individuals and groups that are in the center get more attention, get more resources. And if there is judgment or evaluation, usually more supportive evaluation and less criticism for their mistakes, as compared to those individuals and groups that are on the margins. Those individuals and groups get less attention, less resources, and if there's judgment and evaluation, harsher judgment, and usually less affirmation for their successes as compared to their more normative counterparts. So, through the simple process of socialization, we get taught who is us and who is them. And that merges with our biology, with our wiring. And that's how nature and nurture integrate. Our predispositions towards bias and stereotypes get integrated with the process of socialization. Unconscious bias shows up in very simple ways. An example of unconscious bias in the workplace is something as innocuous as a name. Research shows that you can take a resume and make 2 copies of the same resume and put a white-sounding name on one and put a Pakistani, Indian, Chinese, or in the context of the US, an African-American sounding name. And the resume with a white-sounding name has a 40 to 50% higher chance for callback for an interview, simply based on the name. And other studies show that there's a gender spin on who we prefer, and that resumes with male-sounding names are more likely to be selected for leadership positions as opposed to resumes with female-sounding names. Unconscious bias plays out in big ways around hiring, but it also plays out in small day-to-day interactions. So for example, in meetings, there may be micro inequities. There might be micro moments in which your bias plays out. So think about the context of school meetings. Who speaks? Who speaks first? Who speaks more? Whose ideas get heard and whose ideas don't? And then ask the courageous question of how does identity play into this? How does race and ethnicity play into that? How does gender, sexual orientation, disability, how do all of these identity features also play into that? Those are the really important questions to ask if you truly want to create an inclusive context for your school. In short, unconscious bias creates blind spots. There's parts of ourselves, our behaviors, our mannerisms, our tone of voice, our body language that we just can't see. It's much easier to see in other people, which means it's easier for other people to see the bias in us. In the context of an organization, what happens is what's known as cultural cloning. Basically, we hire, we promote, we advance those most like the decision makers. There is zero effort that is required to recreate the organization, to recreate the school to look like it always has, meaning in terms of who is teaching, who is leading, who is hiring, who is promoting. It requires actually intervention, conscious intervention, both from individuals as well as the institution to tackle unconscious bias and systemic forms of discrimination like racism and sexism. The field is not even. And inclusive leadership requires us to understand that. To be inclusive leaders, to tackle our bias, to be able to see those parts of ourselves that we can't see, all of this work is rooted in self-awareness. We have to understand ourselves, not just our conscious dimensions, which are easier to access, but our unconscious dimensions, the parts that live in the land of body language, of tone of voice, of those decisions that we make over and over again that we may not be able to see as clearly. Again, we can see this more clearly in others, which means others can see it more clearly in us. So then the question becomes, how do we develop self-awareness? Well, there are some things that I would suggest. First of all, it actually starts with compassion, specifically self-compassion, because leadership in the model that I come from is about making mistakes and learning from our mistakes. And we generally are error averse by design. Our unconscious parts of ourselves do not like making mistakes because it fills us up with big feelings. And so we tend to avoid mistakes, yet we have to be able to lean into mistakes. And so self-compassion can help that. Starting this whole project with the idea that I'm going to make mistakes and I'm going to learn. And the self-compassion allows us to move forward from our mistakes and take the learning, as opposed to avoid making mistakes or pretending like we don't make mistakes. 2, ruthless and brutal self-honesty. We have to be able to come to terms with who we are, what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, and what our potential blind spots might be. And again, this requires a lot of courage as well as compassion. 3, feedback. We need feedback from other people. We need feedback from not just those that we report to above us, but we need feedback from our peers, and especially for the context of schools, we need feedback from people that report to us, teachers, teaching assistants, and all the staff, as well as students. Our ability to take in feedback actually helps us with that part of ourselves we can't see, that part of ourselves that's harder to know. And again, feedback requires courage as well as compassion. 4, get comfortable with identity. We have to talk, you have to talk about race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, language, region, religion, and so on. You have to get comfortable talking about the group identities. And in polite Canadian society, it feels like we shouldn't talk about group identities, but we have to, because at an unconscious level, we're processing identities anyway. And the more comfortable we get with talking about identities, the more we're going to be able to work through the problems and edges that come with systemic discrimination in the forms of racism, sexism, and so on. 5, historical political knowledge. We have to understand the historical, political, economic decisions and situations that have resulted in where society is today, where the education system is today, and how we got here. For example, without understanding the history of residential schools and the Indian Act, it's very difficult to take steps towards reconciliation or even understand why reconciliation might be important with Indigenous communities today, the history of broken treaties, and so on. If you don't understand the history of blackface, then you might not understand why darkening one's skin for a Halloween costume might be as offensive to one community as a swastika is to another. So historical political knowledge is absolutely critical as part of the self-education work all inclusive leaders have to do. Each of the 5 steps I've outlined will in fact make leaders vulnerable. And that's the strength, not the weakness in the work. Inclusive leadership is about vulnerability. We have to step into those parts of ourselves we don't know, embracing the unknown, embracing not knowing. And that is what actually allows us to bring in the diversity of voices, to make our teams more inclusive. It starts with us role modeling our vulnerability, role modeling what we know and what we don't know, role modeling our strengths, and being able to talk about how we're working on our weaknesses. When it doesn't happen, it can actually be really demoralizing for our staff as well as our students. So let me illustrate with an example. There's an early years teacher that I know. This person is exceptional at what they do. Their ability to work with kindergarten students, to bring in the equity perspective, to bring in the self-regulation perspective is phenomenal. So this exceptional teacher actually left a school because their principal was unwilling and unable to see their expertise. Their principal recommended using flashcards in the context of working with students. Now, this teacher knew the research inside and out and said, well, actually, flashcards are not great. That's not how we should be doing things. And yet, this principal insisted that they must. They didn't know more than the teacher, but were unwilling to accept that they didn't know more, that they were unwilling to be vulnerable to the fact that there might be someone on their staff that knows a lot more about early years than they do. The mark of an inclusive leader is to be able to harness the strengths of their team. The mark of an inclusive leader is the ability to say, there are going to be people that know a lot more than me on certain subjects, and to be able to step into that and to be able to leverage that. Now, you can only do that if you know your teachers. You can only do that if you're open to your own mistakes. You can only do that if you are open to being vulnerable, to receiving feedback, to have the humility that you might not know. And it is one of the most common mistakes that I see principals as well as managers make across any organization, both inside and outside education, is the fact that they feel like they have to know the answers. Well, that is the opposite of vulnerability. And in fact, it's brittle because people underneath you can see it. They may be responding to you, but not because they respect you, but because you're using your position to force your way. The net result is this teacher ended up leaving a school. The excellence in that school level dropped at least a notch or two because this really good early years teacher couldn't stay because of the leadership. And student outcomes and well-being would also have been reduced because you've lost a fantastic staff member. And this is where the 5 strategies come in. Do I know my strengths and my weaknesses? Am I willing to accept them? And am I willing to get other people's help? People on my team who have the strengths. How can a leader know everything? That's just not possible. Good leaders, inclusive leaders, effective leaders know how to leverage their team, know how to leverage and motivate the strengths and support each other. We don't have to know everything, but often in leadership, we feel like we do. So inclusive leadership is about vulnerability, and it means holding that growth mindset that we're constantly in a state of learning. And we have to be able to model this for our staff and our students. How we lead our staff, how inclusive we are, how open we are, how vulnerable we are. This has direct impact on student achievement and well-being. In order to be an inclusive leader, fundamentally, you have to know your staff. You have to know your students and families, and you have to know the community or communities that are served by your school. The most common thing I hear from both minoritized, racialized staff or students is, how can my principal help me? They don't know anything about me. And that's a deep thing. That means that we have to know the stories, the context within which we are trying to lead a school. The research shows that anti-Black racism is pervasive. The research shows that anti-Indigenous racism is pervasive. The research shows that ableism and students with learning disabilities and other kinds of disabilities are falling through the cracks. We know this over and over again, and we have to understand this. For us to be defensive about it is actually a very poor use of time. And this is again where the vulnerability piece comes in. To use a positive example, there's a story that I was told. A white administrator in a school received a phone call and had a meeting with a parent of a Black student. And this parent was very upset because the student had gotten into trouble at school. Now, this parent's response was to say, "You are racist. The school is racist. How you are treating my child is racist." That's a big charge. That's a heavy thing to hear. And this administrator, who happened to be white, she understood the context of the community and understood the context within which that comment was coming. And instead of being defensive and saying what many administrators say, which is, no, there's no racism in our school, she said, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that that was your experience. I know that racism, especially anti-Black racism, is real. And it's out in society. We know it's in education, and it might very well be playing out in our school. So I want to talk to you about it. Tell me more. So rather than getting defensive, she opened herself up to feedback. And this parent talked and shared and felt heard for the first time in her child's career. That's to illustrate that the solution comes with vulnerability. The solution comes not with defensiveness. It comes with knowledge of context, of politics. And that administrator didn't necessarily say that this incident that you're talking about was racist. She said, I want to know more. But what she did was put into context that racism could be playing out because it's playing out in society all the time. So let's talk about it and figure out if that might have been what's happening here. That allowed the parent to really be heard. That allowed the parent to also take one step towards trust, because the parent said, thank you, I've never been heard before. And then they took their steps forward in whatever that case was. So I just want to illustrate that once again, if we have knowledge of context, historical, political knowledge, if we understand the patterns, if we're open to feedback and also know our community and are open to building relationships, that is how we take steps forward in this equity journey. And that is how student well-being and student achievement can also be advanced in our work. One additional point about student achievement and student well-being. It is all rooted in creating environments where social and emotional literacy is actually the foundation. It's rooted in understanding the social and emotional needs of students. And if we have an environment that actually nurtures the social and emotional needs of the students first, understanding the needs of their identity, understanding the needs of inclusion, that in fact, literacy and numeracy come much more easily. And that's what the research shows, and that's also the experience of our organization shows. But in education, we tend to have it backwards. We tend to prioritize literacy and numeracy and then sort of add on social and emotional literacy, add on equity and inclusion as afterthoughts. To illustrate what I mean, we had worked with a middle school in the GTA. And this was in a high-needs, low-income area. And we worked with the grades 6 to 8s in that particular school. And we actually did a whole number of activities and exercises and processes that basically helped develop a sense of inclusion, helped develop emotional literacy. We used restorative circles as part of that process. And we did this as an intervention really only over a couple of days. And there was a committed group of teachers, as there often is, who wanted to take this work and keep advancing it and turn it into a regular part of their school's process. And they basically set up the equivalent of restorative circles that students who had gone through our training could just attend voluntarily at the end of each week. And the lead teacher told me that over a 2-year period, they actually saw suspension and expulsion rates drop. Her words were, we actually got to spend more time teaching because we actually took care of the needs. She said, sometimes we had the entire senior basketball team there talking, sometimes emoting and even crying about things they were struggling with. Sometimes it was a mixed group, mixed ages. Sometimes it was the senior girls or junior girls. But it was a space that allowed students to actually feel like they were being validated. Their experiences were being validated. They were being heard by one another as well as a teacher in the school. And I offer that as a story to say that as evidence, and there's more evidence out there besides our experience, that when you put the social and emotional pieces and the equity pieces in first, the literacy and numeracy comes much more easily.